So welcome back to the Market Mentors podcast, John.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Absolute pleasure. So before we get stuck into this one, I'd love to know what your relationship is with B2B tech marketing.
Yeah, of course. So I have a long and illustrious career, so spanning some 27 years, but really the last 12 or so years, I've been focused on B2B and B2B marketing specifically. So in that 12 years or so, I've worked on both the vendor side. So I ran sales and marketing teams at Samsung and Rackspace Cloud. And then more recently on the media side of things. So with Spiceworks, it's one of those companies. It was recently acquired by Ziff Davis, but previously they were the world's largest community for IT professionals. And then Dennis Publishing. So I ran the B2B business at Dennis Publishing, which spanned B2B tech, automotive, and financial services. So a lot of in-depth knowledge of B2B from lots of different angles.
Awesome. And we're going to sort of jump in a little bit further down the line to Spiceworks and kind of what you did with those guys. But jumping straight into this then, I mean, what are the opportunities for companies that sit on a lot of data then right now?
So I think the first thing to say is that in my experience in the companies that I've worked with and I speak to, they don't understand and they don't appreciate the data that they actually have, or they could have. So they don't appreciate the extent of the data assets that they are currently sitting on, and that's two sides. Firstly, their own data. So the data that they actually have, they might be capturing, but they don't really understand where it is and what it is and what they could do with it, or that is potential for them to capture, but they're not doing it. So they're not using the different techniques. They're not sourcing that data from their audience or audiences to be able to build that data set or those data sets. And the second thing is data from third parties. So they're not really, in my experience, tapping into the relationships that they could have, that they could build with external third parties that can firstly enrich the data and the data sets that they already have, but also augment it, and especially in areas like looking at intent. So by creating partnerships, building relationships with other people that have different data, being able to use that to model and map and triangulate to find in-market buyers for their particular product or service. Now, increasingly, there is the technology and the platforms to be able to do that, and so there are there's a number of players out there that companies can work with that can help them unlock their own data, but B, like I say, work with other partners, other third parties to be able to do some really, really interesting stuff in terms of modeling and intent prediction and things like that.
Because ultimately, this data has a value, doesn't it? That's the whole reason we're kind of talking about it, aren't we?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, two things. Firstly, there's the value in what you can do with the data. So how you can unlock the data and the different models that you can build on the back of that. But also as an asset, as in it significantly increases the valuation of a company. If a company has rich data assets and they are scaling, then that is hugely valuable for future investors. So definitely it's very, very valuable.
And what do you think those companies struggle with most then when they're trying to sort of utilize this data?
So I think firstly, it's their ability to capture that data in the first place. I think a lot of companies are still very simplistic in the way that they're capturing data, very single-minded. So a lot of them are still relying on one or a few techniques to actually do that. So, for example, newsletters. Most people, I would say, have a newsletter. That's their main way of capturing user data. But outside of that, there's so many other things that they can do and could turn on quite easily, but they're not doing. So I think the first thing is their ability to capture the data in the first place. I think secondly is, again, I think there's a lack of understanding and appreciation around the legislation side of things. So when it comes to data privacy, compliance, and so forth, and I think people have become or think they've become comfortable now with GDPR, for example. So GDPR has been around for 5 years, and I think people have kind of not got lazy, but they've taken their eye off the ball in terms of what is GDPR, how should it be applied, and so forth. And that's a moving feast, a changing feast, as well as if you look at the global picture, legislation that's coming in elsewhere. So I think the understanding of what there is from a legislation point of view, how it works, how you should be applying it to your business and your data. But then I think because of that, people haven't built scalable data assets that are usable at this point in time, never mind about going forward. So I think that's a massive issue and a massive hole that a lot of companies are now facing. And then I think the third area is what you do with the data in terms of how you build it using things like nurture and nurture techniques. And again, in my experience, I would argue that the majority of companies that I come across are pretty poor when it comes to their ability to nurture users, nurture prospects, customers, however you want to describe them, especially looking at nurture from a firstly data point of view, but also from a multi-channel point of view. So I think they're the three areas that I think companies are struggling with. So ability to capture data, their understanding of the legislation, and then their capabilities around nurture.
Yeah, I can imagine the legislative point of view is a big barrier, like you said, because it's a bit of a rabbit hole, isn't it? If you don't have people with the experience or the expertise in your own company, a lot of organizations just back off and just say, okay, well, we're just not going to go anywhere near it. So it's almost like a deterrent in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was dealing with a company a few weeks ago where I started asking them these questions around data and how are they collecting data, how are they collecting and tracking the permissions that they have around that data. And I said, well, can I speak to your DPO? And they're like, we don't know who our DPO is. And so I think internally there is a lack of training and understanding around how data legislation works. And it is business critical these days. But then also, like I say, it is changing so much. The interpretation and the application of, for example, GDPR has very much evolved over the last 5 years. So staying on top of that is key to all of this.
Yeah, fair enough. So if we're sort of talking to a company that wants to grow its overall first-party data, I mean, you talked about a couple of bits and bobs there, but what do you think they could be doing then to capture more data in the first place?
So the starting point is to look at the value equation. So if somebody's going to give you their permission to be able to engage in contact with them, but also their data, then you've got to give them a reason, and you've got to give them a good reason to do that. So I think the starting point, again, something not a lot of people think about, is what is that value equation? So what can I be providing that's going to give somebody the incentive to give me their data? So there's I always talk about this kind of three key areas to focus on. So number one is content. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can use content and wrap a data collection and data augmentation around content. So that could be you have value add content on your site that you give access to if somebody gives you their data. It could be certain sections of your site that you want to give people access to if again, they give you data. I would class things as, like newsletters I mentioned before. That's content, and white papers, downloads, ebooks, anything like that, where there's an intrinsic value to that kind of content, and somebody would give you a permission and also the data around that in exchange for access to that content. So the first area, I think, and again, I think a lot of people aren't really using that as much as they could be. The second one, and this one is, I've seen this massively change the fortunes of businesses, and that's using tools. And when I talk about tools, I'm talking about things like calculators, wizards, templates, and these are often, I think there's almost a fear factor. A lot of people think, these are going to take ages and cost a lot of money to develop. No, absolutely not. These can be very, very simple to implement. There's companies out there, there's websites out there you can, for things like calculators, you can literally buy off the shelf reskin, and plug quite easily into your website. But the ability for them to then capture data is phenomenal, because not only are you giving somebody the reason to give you that initial, contact information, for example, but then the tool itself is collecting data. So the tool itself is giving you potentially really interesting, really significant data that you can then use further down the line. So tools, I think, is a massive area that's underutilized. And then the third one is insights. So, for example, that's things like giving access to survey results, or giving access to a piece of research or a report or something like that. Again, huge value. To give access to that sort of stuff in exchange for data is another key technique to be able to use. So those three things, content, tools, and insights, I think are three areas that people can look at and focus on and build out in terms of how they can then start collecting more of that first party data.
Awesome. And in terms of the tools, I'm thinking of how I've seen that in a B2B environment. I've seen it more in a B2C environment when you think about, I don't know, tax calculators or
Yeah.
mortgage costs. You can go in and sort of plug that sort of stuff in. But I always remember HubSpot when did they do the sort of website grader or something like that?
Yeah,
They
they
started
did.
launching their tools quite early on. It was a free thing. You go in there, you plug in a few details, and I can't remember what information it was getting from you, but I'm sure there was a bit. But it would grade your website, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Another one, when I was at Rackspace, we had a cloud cost calculator. So you would go in there, you'd put certain information about your use cases and things like that, and it would spit out, okay, these are the sort of costs that you would be expecting to pay. Now, on the back of that, you're getting a lot of information about what the client is looking to do with their cloud environment. So, like I say, tools are a gold mine for data, massively underutilized, and they're really cheap and easy to implement. I've seen them again used for in financial services is a really difficult area to get data because of the legislation around it and things like that. But again, those kinds of calculators, and even from a B2B perspective, are absolutely key in terms of being able to get really, really hard to access data.
Good stuff. So once the data's flowing, then how do we sort of change it from a sort of unknown audience then to a known audience? You perhaps mentioned some tools earlier, did you?
Yeah. So I mean, firstly, like I say, the first part of that is that value equation. So the first part of it is very much, to turn an unknown audience into a known audience, you've got to capture that data in the first place. So giving them that value equation to do that. But like I said before, the key thing that I think a lot of people don't focus on, don't invest in, is the nurture side of things. And I think people think of nurture as email. And for me, it's so much more than that. So firstly, thinking about nurture in the context of multi-channel. So how are you, and again, this comes back to the more data you're collecting, the more you can do this. But essentially, how are you integrating the site experience with email, with social, with messenger platforms and things like that? So there's lots of different channels and tools that you can build into an overall nurture program or a nurture strategy that means that you're building kind of repeated touches. And as you're having those repeated touches, it's then looking at what's the data that you can be collecting at all of these different points. So that could be declared data. So it could be you're specifically asking people, and a great technique that you use is what's called progressive profiling. So that's essentially where you find out a piece of information about a person, a company, or a purchase process or whatever it is, and then further down the line, further through that nurture program or nurture sequence, you build on that. So you've already got one piece of information. You know something about that person, company, and then okay, what else do you need to know that builds on that? And so you ask a second and a third and a fourth. So progressive profiling is a great technique, using that in conjunction with nurture to find out more and more about the particular person, individual, company, etc. that you're looking at. So it's really about how you build those journeys.
And we touched on GDPR earlier. I mean, what are some of the sort of 2 or 3 points that you perhaps think that companies should be aware of then when they're collecting this sort of data? Some of the, maybe if we're talking to an audience that isn't so A lot of listeners are based all over the sort of world. For us, the US is quite a big market as well. So they're not perhaps fully clued up on things like GDPR, but maybe a sort of, a high level 101 on GDPR. But what should companies need to sort of be aware of from this perspective?
So I think there's a big lack of understanding still around GDPR. I mean, GDPR was implemented 5 years ago now, and the way that it has evolved, should we say, both in terms of the way that companies themselves are applying it, but also the legislative bodies, the authorities, the ICO, for example, has been looking at it and applying it in terms of the legislative side. So I think the big area that relates to, and the example I would use, is how companies are using legitimate interest. So legitimate interest has always been a bit of a, let's call it a loophole when it comes to GDPR. And essentially what legitimate interest is, for those that don't really understand it. So GDPR essentially states that you have to have an explicit permission where somebody opts in for you to be able to access and use and store their data. Legitimate interest was a bit of a get out clause where GDPR said that, okay, if a company can prove that there is a legitimate interest for them to need to have that data and use that data for the purposes of supplying whatever products and service to that user, to that individual, then that's okay, as long as they've proved it. Now, a lot of companies, especially on the media side of things, should we say, saw that as a bit of a way of arguing, okay, well, we've got this legitimate interest and we can say, well, to be able to, for example, serve advertising to people, we need to know who they are and we need to know about them. It's always been a bit of a grey area. And a lot of companies have kind of taken it as almost the easy option to say, okay, we've got a legitimate interest, therefore we can collect this data and we can use it. That has, I think, over time, especially more recently, really tightened up. And the authorities, the ICO, is now really clearly saying you cannot, unless you have a very specific reason, you cannot be using legitimate interest. So, for example, in the context of advertising, the IAB has or is in the process of introducing or updating their guidelines and their policy to be able to literally say you cannot use legitimate interest going forward. So as of July this year, companies that sign up to the IAB Transparency and Consent Framework, the TCF, won't be able to apply legitimate interest for the purposes of serving advertising. And so that's one example. But essentially, GDPR as a whole is a bit of a moving feast. It isn't set in stone. It's all down to how it's applied and kind of the test cases around it. So it's understanding that, especially, like I say, at this point in time, around how companies apply legitimate interest. Now, if you're then talking globally, I think the good thing globally is that GDPR is still the gold standard. GDPR, even though the UK has left Europe, still applies in terms of, the rules still apply in the UK. And if you look at the legislation that's coming elsewhere in the world, for example, in the US, nothing goes beyond GDPR at this point in time. It's really important to understand what's happening in the US, though. So in the US, you have a number of states, so California, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, Virginia, who have very detailed data privacy legislation already in place. There's another 12 states that are in the process of putting similar legislation in place. There is also a conversation at a federal level that's going through Congress to apply essentially a US equivalent of GDPR. So that would mean that you would have federal legislation and state level legislation that a company has to adhere to. So this is becoming a very complicated picture. The way I approach it and the way I think about it is, if you adhere to GDPR, which is the gold standard, you pretty much, you are okay. I think the challenge comes when you're dealing with US companies, because US companies especially don't really, I think, still understand what GDPR means and how it applies to them, even if they're based in the US. So it's thinking about this stuff on a global basis and really understanding what's going on. But the key thing is understanding where you sit with GDPR, especially around legitimate interest, would be my starting point.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So we are, if we think about the process we've been through then so far, we're collecting the data, we're augmenting the data, we're kind of understanding intent there. How do you then start to sort of build that demand gen engine? I think you mentioned that sort of at the start of the podcast.
Yeah, I think the key thing is to distinguish between demand generation and lead generation. So the way I look at that is lead generation, which is kind of the old school way of thinking, the old school way of doing things. You were literally asking somebody to put their hand up, usually fill in a form around a piece of content. So, for example, a white paper, and say, "Oh, I might be interested in this product or service." 9 times out of 10, they're not, because really all they just want is that particular white paper or that particular asset. Demand generation, though, for me, the way I look at it is a journey. So what you're doing is starting with, how do you identify that somebody could be in market for a particular product or service? So again, it comes back to the data that you're collecting to really understand, is that a prospect? Are they somebody that might be interested down the line? It's then building those journeys. It comes back to nurture. It comes back to, okay, taking them through those stages, taking them through that buying journey. All the while you're doing it is looking at how you're adding value. So thinking about your content journey at different stages. So looking at, how you're building and creating content for that early. They're just, trying to figure out, do they have a problem they're trying to solve? Going through that kind of research phase, shortlisting, and then ultimately, what do they need to understand to actually make the purchase? Building that content journey around the data, understanding where exactly somebody is at any point in time, and being able to adapt to that, because no journey is identical. So the key with demand generation is really understanding that, using the data, overlaying the contents in and around that, and then building those engagements all the way through. But the key thing, as I say, is how are you building value? And then get the person to the point where you understand enough about them that that's the right point to be engaging with them. That's the right point to be converting them into an opportunity that you can then service. So demand generation is all about the journey.
And you're talking about an MQL or even an SQL, depending on what sort of stage you're at. You're talking about those sort of, these terms are sort of quite loose, aren't they? And it's a bit of a debate these days, but ultimately, leads still need to be qualified, don't they?
Yeah, and I think the whole concept of MQL, SQL is a bit of a trap, because ultimately this is one system. Yeah. And ultimately, it doesn't matter whether it's marketing generating it and sales or however, but essentially it's an opportunity. And it's about how, over the course of this journey, do you qualify that opportunity to the point where they're ready to be converted. And so I think there is a bit of a danger in thinking of it as generating an MQL, generating a sales accepted lead, generating a sales qualified lead, et cetera, because it pigeonholes. Whereas really what you're trying to do is build your understanding around the individual, the buying group, the organization, to the point where you know enough about them and you've got enough indicators to say they're in market, this is what they're looking for, they're ready to buy, let's engage with them, let's convert them at that point.
Great. And to put some context behind this, we were talking the other day about your time at Spiceworks then, where you went through this exact process. But at a high level then, how did they utilize the data that they had then? And how did that sort of influence the company's revenues going forward then?
So firstly, it was understanding the data. So they had access to a number of different data sets, and it was a question of appreciating that and then looking at how you put them together. So their business but the starting point was they had a set of tools. And so those tools were creating what I call hard data. So they were able to see, for example, what hardware, software a business was using. So that's the first data set, is that hard data that they had access to. The second data they had was behavioral, because then they could see, what people were doing, how they were behaving across their sites, and gathering information about what kind of content they were consuming and everything like that. Third area was social. So like I say, they were the world's largest community for IT professionals. So within that community, they could see what kind of questions were people asking, what kind of responses were they getting, and really understanding a lot more around the conversations, around the pain points, and so forth. And then on top of all of that, they built in declared data. So they were asking, they did lots of surveys, they did a big kind of annual tentpole state of the nation kind of survey, gave them huge amounts of insights. So essentially the first thing was appreciating all of those different pots, putting them together. And so it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but essentially the more you can put your data together, the more you can start seeing individuals and seeing companies. And if you can get really intricate, starting seeing buying groups, buying committees, then the more you can do with it. So putting the data together using, for example, a customer data platform, enable them to then start unlocking all of this data. Once you have that, you can then start firstly creating much more refined audience groups, so segments that you can start working with, and really starting to build those journeys. So really starting to build, and what they were very good at was kind of mapping that buyer journey. So looking at individuals from a data perspective to understand, what were they doing, what content were they consuming, how were they engaging, all the way through to the point where then they were buying whatever product or service. The way Spiceworks then, because Spiceworks ultimately was think of them as a publisher, they were a platform. So they were monetizing that by helping their clients, the B2B vendors, to firstly interact and engage at the right points through those journeys. And they could do that in a number of different ways, whether that was through advertising, whether that was through email, whether that's through social, and things like that. And ultimately to the point where they were generating intent and generating leads to be able to service those into those vendors. So they built a whole system and a whole model around that. But it's the underlying principles. It's the underlying principles of putting data together, creating rich profiles on the back of that, using that to create segments, using that then to automate those journeys, and ultimately, creating an engine where you're constantly surfacing and then moving demand forward and pushing it into wherever you need to, whether that's a buying process, whether that's into a partner or whatever.
Fascinating. And how did Spiceworks revenue sort of grow while you were there? I know you mentioned they'd just been acquired, are they?
Yeah, they were acquired a few years, 2-3 years ago now by Ziff Davis. They were growing at sort of between 50 and 70% annually. It was a high growth business in terms of and this is at a point where the advertising market was in stagnation. So they were starting to make their revenue from areas like demand generation rather than traditional advertising and so forth.
And do you think this applies to certain industries then? I mean, I know you've done a bit of work in publishing with Dennis Publishing. I can understand how this would work for organisations like that. Certainly Spiceworks, that sounds like it would it obviously has worked there. But are there any particular segments when you're thinking, okay, well, this could really work very well for companies in those segments?
I've worked across the piece. Like I say, I've applied this from tech, financial services, automotive, marketing, advertising. So the underlying principles are all the same. Every audience out there generates data. Every company has the ability to access that data. There's a logic to it, which is if you can put that data together, if you can start seeing individuals and companies within that data, if you start building richer profiles by the amount of data that you're collecting in terms of profiling and so forth, and using that to identify intent, then absolutely you can apply that to any business. And I think coming back to earlier in the conversation, I think the ability for companies in different sectors to work together and put data together is opening up huge doors for people to take this to another level. And so for example, I'm working on the automotive side at the moment, where working on data around firstly who owns particular cars, but then matching that with something like, for example, parenting magazines. So you can see that there's a correlation between people that own certain types of cars and people that are starting to read and buy parenting magazines, because we know that one of the key tipping points in kind of automotive buying is lifestyle or life cycle changes when people have a family. So it's looking at data like that in terms of how are you starting to put data together to try and find insights and trying to find opportunities and intent. And there's a maturity model to data. So the first level is insights. And I think most people think of data in terms of insights. They're not necessarily maxing that in terms of there's still an awful lot more that people can do. But the starting point is, how are you gathering data to tell you more about what's going on? The next level beyond insights is, how are you using data to understand intent? And so that's where you're building these demand models, where you're building these journeys to be able to say, okay, somebody is in. It's the old adage in marketing that only 3% of your audience is in market at any one point in time. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't be working with the other 97%, but how do you build that system to know, firstly, when that 3% are there, but also how do you get the other 97% into the 3%? So intent, how do you build businesses around intent? And then the third area, and it's kind of where things are moving, is what I call intelligence. And that's where you're really starting to put all these data sets together to create a system that is creating something and delivering something by essentially combining the data that couldn't exist without it. So, this is a whole field of AI and everything like that.
Well, that's where technology comes in, isn't it? That's where technology plays the part there.
Yeah, but it's all powered by data. AI would not exist without data. And so that's kind of the next evolution, and that's where things are going.
Fascinating. Right, switching up things slightly then, John. If you were hiring for somebody in demand gen, then what sort of skills and attributes would you look for?
I think first thing is there needs to be that affinity leading to understanding of the customer, because ultimately that's what data is. I mean, ultimately data is just a reflection and a representation of a person and what that person's doing. So especially when you're talking about marketing, I think it's very much, the starting point is somebody that understands and has a passion for the customer. A bit of a cliche, but I think it's really, really relevant and really, really important. So, how they do that and how they immerse themselves in the customer. I think the second thing is it does require an attention to detail. It is, demand generation is all about the detail. And so understanding that level, I think, is really important. Being able to kind of really get into the weeds is really important, because these journeys are very intricate. And so, having that mindset and the ability to get to that level, I think is key. But at the same time, I think the third skill here is, it's the ability to zoom in and out. So yes, it's very detailed. Yes, it's understanding those journeys at a kind of micro level. But also what you need to be able to do is zoom out to the other extreme to be able to see the big picture. And to really understand, what's happening at a macro level in terms of the different use cases, in terms of the different experiences and so forth, to really because ultimately it's a macro level conversation in terms of how are you moving people forward. And so third skill, I think, is that, the ability, and one of the early managers I had, it's like the hawk, who's hovering above the field and has the ability to see the whole field, but then zoom in on the mouse and go straight down into the detail, and the ability to go between the two very, very quickly. And that's how I look at it, is that level of kind of ability to get in and out of the weeds quickly is key. So they're the three things I would say in terms of kind of skills that I'd be looking for in somebody.
Yeah, I love it. I think the role of a B2B marketer has changed vastly over the last few years, isn't it? So you've got so many different moving parts these days, from data to tech to creative to the whole process that you go through. So it's not an easy job, is it?
No, it's not. And I think I've been doing B2B marketing. Like I say, I've kind of in and out of it for sort of 27 years and really focused on it for the last 12 years. And the pace of change is just unrelenting. But I think ultimately, it comes back to, even though I talk a lot about data, it comes back to the human. And, there's been a big movement, and I've worked with a lot of people over the last few years in terms of humanizing B2B. And I think that's really important. I think it's about that empathy, understanding the individual. Now, I look at the individual both from a, like I say, humanistic point of view, but also from a data point of view. But it's understanding that you're dealing with humans and having that ability to relate and empathize and understand where people are, that helps across the piece. So it is changing. It has changed a lot. It will continue to change. The pace of technology is as I say, unrelenting. But coming back to that basic principle that you're dealing with humans and dealing with people, and understanding how you apply that to data, to demand generation, to B2B as a whole, I think is absolutely key.
Superb. Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, John. A really interesting chat, particularly at times like this where a lot of companies are looking for new revenue channels, are looking how to monetize their data, the information they've got. So it's been great talking to you about it and the process that you would typically go through. If anybody's listening to this and they want to talk to you about this more, what's the best way of them contacting you?
So you can catch me on LinkedIn, DM me on LinkedIn, or my website. So the company I have now is called Get2Growth. So get2 with the number 2 growth.com.
Perfect. Fantastic. Thanks very much, John.
Absolute pleasure.